Pennsylvania State Representative Chris Rabb, representing the 200th Legislative District in the Keystone State, which contains Philadelphia County, joins us now on Decision Makers. He also currently sits on the Judiciary, Agriculture and Rural Affairs, Finance, and Commerce Committees. Good to have you, Representative. Always good to see.
Likewise.
All right. So, Pennsylvania's state budget right now still hasn't fully passed as it languishes in the Senate. Now, the House, you guys were able to pass a $50.6 billion budget for the state, but that's 900 million down from Governor Shapiro's $51.6 billion proposal, right? So, work us through that a little bit if you can. Why the cut in the original proposal?
Well, I think to some extent, there were some ambitions that the governor had that did not pan out in terms of political feasibility in a divided legislature. So a lot of people don't understand that Pennsylvania is not only the largest full-time state legislature, it is also divided in the sense that the House is controlled by Democrats. We have a one-vote majority there. And the Senate is controlled by Republicans. I believe 47 or 48 state legislatures. Those legislatures have the same party in those bicameral branches in the legislature. So that makes it very difficult to govern because our priorities are radically different. And one of the priorities that the governor had, which would influence the budget certainly, is adult use cannabis legalization. So legalizing weed for consenting adults, whether they had a medical condition or not. That would have brought in, well, it's speculative how much money that would have brought in for tax revenues. But we also have issues on the expenses side that directly relate to the federal cuts through the Trump administration and how we address those matters. And it's a precarious situation because while this hits states and hits states hard, it is also the same party that is in control in the Senate that's in control in Washington, D.C. So to do the right thing by Pennsylvanians is at the same time in opposition to the choices that the Trump administration has made that put states in a very precarious situation financially. So when we talk about Medicare and Medicaid, those are federal entitlement programs that are funded through states to administer. And when those have serious cuts, who has to step up? Well, that's states. But if you believe in smaller government and you believe in tighter entitlements, then you're talking about a Senate that doesn't want to do right by the folks who are beneficiaries of those federal programs that are administered by the very states, the state that whose services we fund as a legislature. And as a result, we have long since passed our constitutionally mandated deadline of June 30th to pass an annual state budget. And it's anyone's guess as to when or how this will be resolved.
So, do we know what the state budget would look like, or the proposal for a state budget would look like, had there not been these cuts or federal cuts to certain programs or certain entitlements? What would it look like, or cuts to what normally would be added in terms of federal money to the state budget?
I don't have the dollar amount. I mean, I think it's around $1 billion, though.
Mm.
I mean, ballpark, $1 billion underfunding for Medicare and Medicaid recipients across the state. So you're talking about a large chunk of Pennsylvanians who are going to be really hurting as a result of these Trump policies. So it's a lot of money. The question is, how do we raise the money or how do we access the money? Those are related things, but are not the same. You can generate new tax revenue, like through taxing legalized cannabis. or skilled games. Um, but you can all, and also increasing the minimum wage, because then you'd have more folks, on payroll at a higher amount, which means you take more that goes to state and federal coffers. But the Senate is not budging on increasing the minimum wage, on legalizing cannabis, and we haven't come to an agreement on skilled games. Um, but there's also a rainy day fund, which is around $10 billion. So while we have a structural deficit that we have not addressed, we have a rainy day fund of roughly $10 billion. That's B billion. And I would say that it's a rainy day right now. People are struggling, and we have the ability to fully fund the things we care about, and not just around federal entitlement programs, also mass transit. SEPTA is both having draconian cuts in terms of service, but also increased fares in a city that is, the largest poor city in the country, or it has the highest proportion of poor people of any major city. And so they rely on public transit, as do business owners, as does tourism, et cetera, et cetera. We are basically defunding SEPTA and all mass transit around the state, because Republicans in the Senate do not, they're politicizing an issue because Democrats will not prioritize things that they care about, perhaps. That's how it seems from my perch in Harrisburg.
We did see those cuts to mass transit, something I've been paying close attention to because I grew up on SEPTA. So heavily used it, had to rely on it. So, that's definitely something I'm paying close attention to. But a lot of cuts or conversations about cuts related to mass transit, also education. So you talked about SEPTA. What's going on with education?
Well, we're in a state where we had a 7-year battle to address full and fair funding of public education based on a constitutional mandate for uh, thorough and adequate public school system across 67 counties. That's how it's referred to, I believe, is the rough paraphrasing in our state constitution. And a very conservative Commonwealth Court, which is an appellate court under the state Supreme Court, ruled that how we fund schools is, my words, not theirs, is essentially educational apartheid. We have the haves and the have-nots. And it was the requirement, they put it back on the legislature to say, make this right. Well, as someone who introduced a bill that required that 100% of state education funds be channeled through the fair funding formula, um, it finally looks like we are moving in the right direction. We have had historic investments in public education under Governor Shapiro. But that said, that's a low bar, because of all the states in the union, we're on the lower side in terms of the percentage of money that goes into public schools that comes from the state budget. And it could be a lot higher. We have the capacity to fully and fairly fund every school across Pennsylvania. We have the ability to fully fund and perhaps even make free all public transit across the state. We have the capacity to provide universal child care or generous child care subsidies to working families. We have that capacity right now. We don't have the political will. And the way we fund all of these things is not some kind of pie in the sky idealism, but is to make all Pennsylvanians pay their fair share, which means that working families and middle class families would pay a lower personal income tax. And the wealthiest amongst us would pay their fair share, which would just be an incrementally more than what they're paying now. And we can generate over $6 billion in new tax revenue, which would address all the issues I talked about and more. It could also fund the very popular whole home repairs program that was introduced by my colleague in the Senate, Senator Nikhil Saval. So we have all of these opportunities, but we don't have the political will to do the right thing. And the reason we are not looking at that is beyond the fact that we have a divided legislature. We also have a very nefarious uh, electoral system where campaign finance issues and lobbying issues are infecting how we govern. So if I may, for context, in Pennsylvania, if a lobbyist wanted to win me over, they could buy me a Tesla and it would be legal in Pennsylvania. You can't buy a colleague of mine in the California legislature a cup of coffee, but someone could buy me a Tesla. A super donor could cut me $1 million check to my campaign, and that's legal. So you got to ask yourself, with this kind of influence through lobbyists and super donors, how does that impact the fairness, the efficiency, the substance of what we do in the legislature? And I would say it negatively affects that greatly.
You sit on the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, so which is unique considering that you're an urban legislator. You're representing a city, one of the largest cities in the country. And so, if you can talk about the budget's impact on an industry that's very significant in a big state like Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
and are you able to find more common ground with Republicans on, given that most Republicans in the state are from rural and ex-urban counties and areas in the state?
That's a great point. Some of my best work that I'm most proud of, that is bipartisan in nature, comes from my long service on the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, on which I've served for 5 terms. As someone who's only familiar with cities directly, it has been serious learning curve. And what I've learned is that where my food comes from. A lot of people who are from cities think food comes from grocery stores and not farms, right? So the first thing I do is I thank farmers whenever I tour a farm or agricultural facility, meat processing facility, you name it. Um, because we are customers for rural farmers. They need us. So there's a strong bond between urban and rural in terms of food consumption. Also, when we talk about environmental impacts, when we talk about employment and labor issues, we talk about energy issues, all of these things relate to agriculture. And also, agriculture is not inherently a rural thing. We also now, because of various innovations, have sustainable and regenerative agriculture that can be done in close quarters, can be done indoors, and therefore can be done as effectively in denser areas like cities and metropolitan areas than in rural and ex-urban communities. And so my hope is that this issue, this topic, can bring us together and help create more bonds between urban and rural, because we have more in common than what divides us. And I've seen that myself over 8.5 years in office. And it is one of our biggest industries. How do we make sure that we are part of that industry and not just as consumers is one of the issues I'm very interested in. And just outside of my district is Saul High School. It's only one of 2 agricultural centered high schools in the entire country, and it's in Northwest Philly. And a lot of those students are Black and brown. And I'm hoping that an increasing subset of graduates from that high school will enter into the agricultural sector, because there's all kinds of things. And a lot of people think that, we should be encouraging folks to go into the tech sector, particularly Black and brown folks, because that's where, so many high paying jobs are, and that's the future. But the reality is there's so much technology involved in modern agriculture that you can do both, right? The technology that modern farmers are using is extraordinary. So I'm very, very encouraged and enthusiastic about opportunities in the agricultural sector for urbanites, particularly our young people.
Mhm. Now, a few moments ago, you were explaining that there's some promise there to generate quite a bit of tax revenue from legal cannabis, also from slot machine like games, right? So, Senate Majority Leader is a bit skeptical about that. He's like, he wants to prioritize the state of the economy first before talking about taxes. So, do you think those two industries could handle uh, increases in tax revenue like that?
Well, in order to regulate something that is now illegal,
Mhm,
um, there will be a tax bill associated with it, right? Because they will
mhm.
be
Okay,
legal businesses that,
got it.
will be taxed. But I do not, as a policymaker, do not believe that we should be using adult use cannabis as a means to generate revenue for other things.
Okay.
Um, because right now, the main proposal for legalizing weed puts the tax at 18%. And as a medical cannabis patient myself, cannabis is expensive. It's expensive. And, I'm middle class. If you're working class or poor and you want access to this, you're not going to get it at dispensaries with an 18% tax. So you're doing a disservice to folks who want to use this newly or, prospectively legal product, but they're not because it's going to be priced out of reach out of most Pennsylvanians. So we shouldn't be looking at cannabis as a means to generate new revenue. Um, and we shouldn't be taxing skilled games as a means of funding public education or mass transit, because if that's where the bulk of the money comes from and something goes sideways, we're back in the same position where we got to scramble to find money elsewhere. The best way to do it is to tax people fairly. Wealthy folks in this state are being undertaxed. They're not going to leave the state if we just incrementally increase their tax bill because it will not hurt them. But it will generate a lot of revenue. And the only reason we're not doing it is because super donors come from that segment and they don't want to be patriotic and pay their fair share. And that's a problem. And one of the things I tell everyone, and you've probably heard me say this in various venues, that whatever your top issue is, whether it's sustainable agriculture or cannabis or skilled games or, Medicare, your number two and number three issues must be electoral reform and media reform, right? Because ultimately, the process by which any of these topics or subjects are addressed and legislated on are going to be influenced by who gets into office and who stays in office. It's basically our democratic institutions. Secondly, how we understand these issues is going to be um, crafted by media. And if all the media outlets are controlled by two or three people, garbage in, garbage out, which is one of the reasons I'm always so thrilled to talk with you because you understand the importance of independent media, and certainly independent Black media. We would not be here if it were not for the historic Black newspapers that told our stories when nobody else would. My great great grandfather founded the Baltimore Afro American newspaper nearly 135 years ago. And it was one of the few newspapers in the country, along with Philadelphia Tribune and the
Mm,
Pittsburgh Courier and others, that told our stories with substance and nuance when mainstream white society refused to. And all of these issues that we're talking about, the narratives around them are being crafted by folks who don't necessarily have our interests at heart because it's all about profit maximization. So, if we have these types of nuanced conversations, we can have better results. But without it, it's it's our collective ignorance is forcing policies to the front that do not do us justice.
mm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that about your great great grandfather. I didn't know about that, so it's an interesting bit of history. So speaking of marijuana outside of medical marijuana, so the promise or the potential of legal marijuana, which is interesting. Like the state neighboring you, for example, Maryland has now legal cannabis. So um, there are a number of concerns there, right? Even as you look at Maryland. there are public health implications. So you have recent research showing that the kind of marijuana that's being popularly consumed is not that healthy, and it causes respiratory and heart problems, along with negative uh, impacts on brain functions, especially in young people. And you've been a major legal cannabis advocate for some time, along, citing the criminal justice dimensions of it. So, how did you reconcile the public health risks, especially considering that a disproportionate number of Black young people, Black young adults, especially Black men, are using this type of marijuana? So, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, those are excellent points. I have a number of different perspectives on this. One, again, I'm a medical cannabis patient.
Mm,
I suffer from PTSD and the symptoms I have. I did not want to address through pharmacological means. I've never really used medications. I didn't want to be an experiment of big pharma. I also had no experience with weed. It was not something I used growing up. I
mm,
just wasn't interested in it. So my entree into weed was as a patient
mm,
to address chronic sleeplessness because that was the major symptom that challenged me. But I'm also a parent, and my one of my children experienced a very negative reaction to experimenting with cannabis and was hospitalized for 10 days. And I got to tell you, that was one of the lowest moments in my life as a parent to see my child become essentially a zombie. He was not who he was before he experimented with this vape. And so I have very nuanced positions. I don't believe that it is everything, right? That it may be good and useful for some, but not all, right? Um, and we have to be, that's why we have to look at adoption and legalizing cannabis through a public health lens because there are serious ramifications for doing this, whether it's driving under the influence and how law enforcement identifies driving under the influence, which has a racially disparate impact, on our communities. How we look at employment. If you're a medical cannabis patient, you can be fired by your boss who just finds out that you're a patient. That's legal in Pennsylvania. I have a bill to ban that practice where you can't just simply fire someone because they are a medical cannabis patient. We have a lot of different issues. And so this needs to be done first and foremost, as you say, through the lens of public health, less so as a means to generate more tax revenue, because then we're going to be cutting corners. And who's going to get hurt? It's going to be the folks on the margins of society. And that's part of the reason a lot of folks want to legalize it, because the racist war on drugs has victimized Black and brown and working class white folk for 50, 70 years. And for what? For what? And I cannot emphasize how important it is to understand that if we don't process this through the lens of public health and also community wealth development, it doesn't matter what else we do that sounds good and inclusive, it will fail. And that's my concern about the conversation we're having around legalizing cannabis right now in the legislature, because with an 18% tax, with an Office of Social Equity that could be very influenced by the political process and is not an autonomous entity to do the things that can help communities most impacted, I have deep reservations.
mm. Where's the What's the status of that bill? I know you have a bill right now, if I recall,
So it's HB
eliminating.
1200. Yeah.
Right. What's the status of that bill?
So the bill to legalize adult use cannabis, or
Yes.
one of my bills.
One of your bills about you want to eliminate DUI charges for medical marijuana patients.
Actually, what that bill does is it has one standard for what intoxication is,
Okay.
right? Not a special one, right? So having the same scrutiny as anyone who abuses Xanax,
Okay.
or anything else. There's a zero tolerance for weed, and it's not based in science. And that means that every single medical cannabis patient who is also a legal driver with the driver's license, every time we get behind the wheel, we could get a DUI, not because we're driving impaired, but because the standard for giving us DUIs is detecting any metabolites in our systems, which could exist in our system for over 30 days. So for someone like me who takes a tiny drop of liquid tincture under my tongue for 30 seconds and swallows, it's going to be in my system a month later. So if I were to get stopped by the cops, it would be in my system. And they're going to say, oh, therefore you are impaired. And that's deeply problematic. So if you're poor, if you're disabled, if you're an elder, if you are someone who is a returning citizen, it will destroy your life because that zero tolerance policy that is not based in science or public health or community safety. So that bill has not come up. It passed out of committee last term. It needs to come be voted on committee to move forward. All cannabis related bills basically were tabled until we tried to get adult use cannabis legalized through a Democratic bill introduced by my colleague, Representative Rick Krajewski, that went over to the Senate, and they promptly voted it down and did not move forward in any meaningful way on any other alternative bills. So once we come back to session assuming it's not included in any remaining budget related bills, I'm hoping that they will bring up my bill along with other bills I've introduced, along with some of my colleagues, to address the medical cannabis ecosystem that is deeply, deeply flawed.
And I know we've gone a little bit over time, Representative. Always appreciate it. I got one question for you about climate change impacts. And so, climate impacts are becoming more and more intense, as you know, especially in terms of a city like Philadelphia, heat waves, island effects. So, these disproportionately affect Black and Brown distressed communities in a city like Philadelphia. See, the poorest big city in the country. So, how is the legislature, your colleagues, addressing that issue, if at all? Is it even addressed in this budget?
Um, Not as nearly as much as I would like. And part of that is because Republicans now overwhelmingly do not believe in the existence in human-made climate change. So that's not even, that term is not even accepted. Also, their love of fossil fuels prevents them from looking at things um, from a evidence-based perspective. And so that also relates to what I said before about around electoral reform. The type of money that's going into politicians who share the opinions and priorities of extractive industries is making governance that much harder. So if fracking is something that is creating a lot of quote unquote good jobs in one's backyard, that person, irrespective of their party or ideology, is either going to be silent or supportive of those extractive industries, oil and gas, et cetera. Um, if you remove money from politics, you'd have a less one-to-one kind of influence that it currently exists in Harrisburg. And again, other states do this, where there's public financing of campaigns and candidates. There are restrictions in terms of lobbying, gift bans, et cetera, that do not exist in our state. So all the things you talk about as it relates to public infrastructure, housing, public health, employment, recreation, mortality issues like are not being addressed because of the corrosive influence of money in politics in our state. And that's a shame. There are more oil and gas lobbyists than there are state legislators. And that's saying something because we are the largest full-time state legislature. There's 253 of us, and yet there are more folks promoting fracking who are lobbyists and government affairs folks than there are people serving the people. And unless and until that dynamic changes, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out.
All right. Thanks again, Representative, for joining us. That's it for this segment. I'm Charles Ellison, your executive producer and host. Let's thank our partner, the Council of State Governments, for their support through the Council on Communities of Color, and another warm round of gratitude to our other partner, the Civic Literacy and Media Influence Institute at Learn for Life, for making this possible. Diane Ellison is executive producer. Raven Robinson is senior producer. Until then, you can find this episode and more while subscribing at thebnote.com. Thanks for watching.